She had stopped noticing the cold 2 days ago. The hunger she had stopped noticing before that. What she could not stop noticing, no matter how she positioned herself, was the bench. Rough, unfinished wood. No padding, no give. After hours of sitting on it, the pain was not dramatic. It didn't make her gasp or cry. It just stayed, steady and unremarkable, the way bad things stay when they have been there long enough to feel like normal. She shifted again. The woman beside her shifted too. Across the barracks, others were doing the same. A room full of small adjustments that added up to the same thing. The benches hurt. Nobody was going to say it, and nothing was going to change. She was certain of that last part. The American guard had been standing near the door for the past 10 minutes. Young, barely older than some of them, rifle slung, hands in his pockets. He wasn't watching them the way guards usually watched, scanning for trouble, tracking movement. He was watching the benches. She noticed this because she had been watching him without appearing to watch him, which was a skill captivity taught quickly. He pressed his hand against the nearest bench, tested the wood. Then he looked at the women on it, then back at the wood. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved more than necessary. Then he turned and walked out the door without a word. The room went very still, not the still of people relaxing, the still of people waiting to find out what they had just done wrong. Because in every system they had known, a guard who left without explanation came back with consequences. She kept her eyes on the door. There were 22 of them in the barracks. Former auxiliaries, most of them telephone operators, clerks, dispatch riders, 2 who had worked in a Luftwaffe communications post outside Cologne. They had been captured 3 days earlier during the collapse of a rear area supply depot, swept up in the chaos of a front that had stopped being a front and become simply a direction things ran from. The camp was a converted factory on the outskirts of a French town, taken over by an American military government unit 6 weeks earlier. It was not organized for female prisoners. The barracks had been cleared quickly and fitted with the materials available. Wooden benches along the walls, a single stove in the center that did its best against the November cold, a bucket of water near the door. Functional. Barely. They had been processed on the first day. Names, occupations, unit information written onto cards in pencil by a tired corporal who asked his questions in careful, accented German. He had been neither friendly nor unfriendly. He had simply done his job and moved on. Since then the days had been quiet. Meals came twice daily, bread, soup, occasionally something canned. The guards changed shifts without incident. Nobody shouted. Nobody threatened. This in itself was a kind of shock that the women were still processing, each in her own way, and none of them out loud. They had been told what to expect. Everyone had been told. The briefings, the pamphlets, the officers who pulled units aside in the last weeks and spoke in low, urgent voices about what American capture meant. They had been told this with the certainty of people who had never experienced it and were certain they were right. The silence, the unremarkable, unglamorous, administrative silence of the camp had done nothing to dissolve the fear. It had only made the fear quieter and more watchful. The absence of the thing you were told to expect is not the same as safety. It is just the waiting room before safety, or before the proof that you were right to be afraid all along. This was the state she was in when the guard walked out the door. She waited. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The other women had gone back to their small occupations. Some sat with their eyes closed, some spoke quietly. One mended the hem of her coat with a piece of thread she had been carrying for 2 weeks. The pain of the benches continued its quiet work on all of them. Then the door opened. The guard came back. He was not alone. Behind him came 2 others, carrying something olive-drab wool folded into rough squares. American military-issue blankets. They moved through the barracks without speaking, placing 1 blanket over each section of bench. Folded double, they were not thick, but they were something between the wood and the body, and something was the difference between pain and less pain. The guard who had been watching set his own blanket over the last section himself. Then he stepped back and looked at the benches the way someone looks when they are checking whether a job has been done right. He didn't look at the women. He didn't wait for a reaction. He simply nodded at the other 2 and they left. The room was very quiet. Nobody sat down immediately. They stood or remained where they were, looking at the blankets on the benches. One woman touched the edge of one lightly with 1 finger, the way you touch something you suspect might not be real. The woman who had been watching the guard looked at the blankets for a long time. Then she said quietly to the woman beside her, "Nobody told him to do that." The other woman said, "I know." The first woman said, "We didn't say anything." The other woman said, "I know." They were quiet for a moment. Then the first woman said, "Then why?" Nobody answered. The question stayed in the room, the way questions stay when they are too large for the space and too important to let go of. Eventually, one of them sat down. Slowly, the way you sit when you are testing something. Her shoulders changed. Not dramatically, just the small release of someone discovering that the thing they were bracing against is less than they expected. Others followed, one by one, the same small release passing through the room. The older woman near the far wall, the one who had been a telephone operator for a military relay station, and who had, by some unspoken agreement, become the person the others looked to when something needed deciding, sat down last. She sat and was still for a moment. Then she looked at the door through which the guard had left. She said, "In Germany, a soldier who did something like this without being ordered to do it would be reported." A younger woman said, "Reported for what?" The older woman said, "For weakness. For giving comfort to the enemy." The younger woman looked at the blanket under her. She said, "Do you think he'll be reported?" The older woman said, "No." The younger woman said, "Why not?" The older woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I don't think that's how it works here." This was not a comfortable thought. It was not meant to be comforting. It was the beginning of something much harder than comfort. The beginning of having to reconsider everything they had been told about the people who were now responsible for them. The days that followed were not easy. The food remained sparse. The cold remained. News from home was non-existent. And the not knowing about families and cities and what the advancing front had left behind was its own kind of weight that no blanket could address. But the blankets stayed on the benches. Nobody removed them. No officer came to take them back. No announcement was made about why they were there or how long they could stay. They were simply there, day after day, an unremarkable fact of the barracks. A week after the blankets appeared, the guard came through during afternoon rounds and stopped near the stove. The fire had burned down earlier than usual. The room was cold. He stood at the stove for a moment, then went outside and came back with an armful of wood. He stacked it beside the stove, loaded 2 pieces in, and adjusted the damper. He said something in English that nobody understood, but the stove began to draw properly, and the heat spread through the room slowly, and the women closest to it moved toward it in the small, careful way of people who are still not certain they are allowed to want warmth. The young one checked the damper one more time. Then he left. That evening, the older woman sat on her bench and watched the stove and thought about the 2 things that had happened. The blankets, the wood, neither of them requested, neither of them announced, neither of them accompanied by anything except the plain evidence of the thing itself. She had spent 4 years inside a system where every act of authority announced itself, where power made sure you knew it was power, where comfort, when it came with a price attached, a debt, a condition, a lesson about who had given it and why you should be grateful in exactly the way they required. She didn't know what to do with authority that didn't announce itself. She sat with this for a long time. The stove crackled. The other women settled into the evening around her. Someone laughed quietly at something, a real laugh, the kind that happens when a person has relaxed enough to find something funny again. She looked at the blanket under her. She pressed her hand against it. The wood beneath was still hard, but the hard was manageable now. And manageable was the difference between enduring and surviving was the difference between this and whatever the alternative had been. She didn't say thank you to anyone. There was no one to say it to, and she wasn't sure the word was adequate to what she was trying to express, which was not gratitude exactly, but something more complicated. The slow, unwilling recognition that the world was larger than what she had been taught, and that some of what she had been taught was simply wrong. Outside, the guard finished his round. The lights along the perimeter came on. The camp settled into its nighttime routine, all the small sounds of a place doing what it was built to do. Inside, 22 women sat on benches that were less painful than they had been a week ago. That was all. It was enough.